All right. So I have two potential topics for us. One is the future of education, what's needed and why, and the other is what the hell is altruism, and is it and is it a and is basically, I can't even voice the question so much, but it's this struggle that I feel intensely between, and I don't know where it comes from, some sort of impulse to act like, to do things that I know will benefit, that I feel are very strongly are for the long-term benefit of people, including myself, and other ways which I don't know what the long-term effects are, but they're much more selfishly motivated, and it's just about like really like becoming this amazing, full, like passionate being that follows and accomplishes wonderful, beautiful things in the world, but I don't know what the results will be.
Let's talk about that one.
Okay. All right. I guess the problem, I have stated the problem already, so I can describe a
Yeah.
little bit how this comes up. It comes up a lot. Like I'm very surprised at how much of a struggle um, this is for me, and I don't remember it used to be that way. I think I used to feel like the actions that I was most desirous of following, and which seems like they would provide kind of most personal um, sense of fulfillment and also fun and play a few years ago, also coincided with what I thought would bring the most benefit to others as well. So, for example, that was like learning how to meditate and becoming enlightened. And now my desires in terms of life are just like just they're huge, wider range of things. It's basically to experience as wide a range of human experience as possible, from deep self-oriented kind of being the reception of devotion and revelatory bliss, and a kind, even to the extent of being self-isolated, ignoring the people around me, and really in a what I take to be a selfish way, and as well as what feels very different than that, being completely oriented um, to meeting people more and more and more and more in a sense of familialness, and kind of deep peer-to-peer relationship in which their personhood, not just their empty flow, but their personhood is radically included, and that's the level at which we're meeting. To things like wanting to really learn linear algebra, and like that, and then for no other reason except it would be fun, or really wanting to learn how to be a computer programmer for no reason other than it'd be fun, or really learn how to really spend a lot of time meditating with good trainers towards a particular goal, because I just think I sort of have a knack for that and would be good at it. And the development of talent is interesting because we get to see what humans can become. So there's this conflict between just these wonderful projects which just feel wonderful, and these other activities which also feel wonderful and good in certain ways, but which I know, or I think I know, are needed and are ethical at this current time and in this current situation that I find myself in for myself and others, but which aren't necessarily as viscerally or spontaneously engaging to me personally. So I feel like there's this odd tension between self and other, again in this way, but also between knowing and not knowing, and Um, yeah, knowing and not knowing, for example, and how that relates to motivation. Um, and I don't really know how to resolve it. At base, it seems like it's already resolved in the sense that I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. Wherever I want to do that. But on top of that, there's this layer of a should and a question about whether or not shoulds are authentic and helpful and what the nature of a should is, especially in the context of altruism and altruistic action.
Well, let's look at where the should comes from. I mean, where do you think what's the nature of the should?
Well, that's a good question. Um, that's a good question. I mean, it's arguably good in a persistent way over time, and in the sense that it's instrumental for bringing about what's innately good, like a life of well-being. Um, Even though it's not interesting to do sometimes, or not as interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's also some kind of desire, which I haven't really gotten to the root of, but it's like, what is this? Where does the sense of altruism come from? My initial forays into it recently from this place of deep questioning is something around when I notice people hurting, I don't want to do that to them. So it's something like compassion. But I don't know where that I don't want to do that comes from. Another thought I've had is that it has some relationship to the the true dependence of self and other, interdependence of self and other. So that if I'm acting in such a way that comes from a place of ignoring or not recognizing the deep interdependence of self and other, then there's always a little bit of stress or tension or a feeling of not rightness in that. And then when I do recognize the importance of the other, just in the sense of existential, we are together all
Mm-hmm.
the time, then action seems to have a stronger, like a firmer ground, basically. Or, kind of a more solid ground in some way. There's less anxiety. There's less denying of reality in some way. So there's a lot going on, and I guess the other sense why this is a struggle, why this is even a problem, so to speak, is because and this is certainly about me, my personal history is maybe more, which is why I want to explore it, is there's a deep emotional feeling of unmetness or unfulfilledness around just following what's wonderful. Rather than doing what's good. And I've most of my life been motivated by doing what's good rather than simply what's wonderful. And so there's that in it as well. So there's a lot. There's a lot going on. Right, so yeah. So there's some fear in just doing what's wonderful, but also like craving for it.
So if you turned your
Oh,
back,
last thing, I want to get out all
no,
the
no,
things
no,
that I've
yeah,
thought about. The last thing is that there's also like an interesting intersection here around entitlement and affluence and opportunity, where I have the privilege basically of having almost, you know, not clearly not infinite, nobody has infinite, but like a great number of options available to me
mm-hmm.
in terms of what I want to do and what I can do. So, and that's not to say that's not here nor there. That's just also part of the equation. Um, so that just adds in other
Yeah.
questions to it. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think let's just talk about the last thing you said in terms of, the fact that we are all interdependent and interwoven and um, one human condition, really. It explains why someone like yourself, someone like myself, can be privileged relative to other people because because we've benefited from the system, right? We have certain have benefits. And so for me, that is a privilege, and it comes with an obligation, right? So if I if I if the community gives all their resources and sends somebody out to go find food, then that person's been privileged, but the obligation is that they also have to come back and lift the community up by finding seeds or something like that. So we can't be responsible for where we show up in history, but we can understand that it's an incredible privilege and that we have an obligation then to use that privilege to liberate some of those structures, perhaps. So other people, they're like a great wave, people moving moving forward. Um, Now that can sound an awful lot like capitalism. The only difference is that capitalism, the waves move, but the privilege always keep moving
Mm.
more. So I'm not talking about that, right? Um, and so I think you probably recognize that, and um, but maybe that's where some of the should comes from, right? So you have a certain obligation.
Right? Because
Um,
that's what, yeah, that's my question is really like, what is the nature of the obligation? Because the way, in the context which I've grown up, obligations feel like choices. They don't actually feel like social or like physical necessities.
mhm.
So then where, what, where is the underlying motivation to to come back, basically, to come back and help, to come back and lift up or liberate, you know?
Um, yeah, I mean, so you have both of these, right? You have an automatic um, enthusiasm for the wonder and for polishing your own your own jewel, and you also have, you know, effortlessly the obligation comes up too. So,
Right.
so chances are, in some respect, they're both authentic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and unless you don't feel that way. I mean, that sometimes the shoulds are not authentic. Sometimes the other ones aren't authentic. There's an awful lot of people who are, you know, born givers and they don't really have ambition and they're just and in certain cultures, especially our culture, you know, people are like, oh, you should do this with your life, you should do that, and people don't really want to do that. So, um, yeah, so and so the conflict comes in because you're not satisfying either one of those, or it's a big either
Certainly
or.
can't certainly, yeah, it's definitely a kind of either or. When I'm stressed out, it becomes even more of an either or. And it's certainly can't satisfy either of them infinitely. So there's always a choice. There's always a attacking which direction, basically. Because they do feel they feel non coinciding at the
Yeah.
moment.
So if you only did the should part, what would that look like? I mean, what is it in your mind? What's the story of the Zach who does the should part?
The should part
Uh,
is um, very specific feeling, and then in terms of action, there's options, but it's not exactly that clear. So the feeling is instead of instead of instead of being instead of emphasizing the sense of um, kind of like self I'm not necessarily using this derogatorily yet, but selfish play,
Mm-hmm.
instead of emphasizing that, instead realize that I'm already quite strong in that and that there's a lot of momentum in that direction, and that continue to follow that momentum won't lead anywhere but further, and instead tack back in a different direction and really meet people and build, and especially meet people in the sense of deep, I can't describe it, but it's a feeling of the attention is between us. My attention is not just in my life and my world, but the attention is always in between us, no matter who I'm with, because that emphasizes our being together.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of action, the only thing that I'm super clear about is that what's needed is the building of the foregoing as much exploratory new relationships as I've been building, as I've been making, and instead build more rooted, established relationships with smaller numbers of people in smaller communities that agree to stick together.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like that's what's missing are communities that, at least in my life, and I think probably much of the culture I live in, um, small communities that agree to stick together and support each other through thick and thin.
So would it be close to accurate for you to say, or for me to say, um, that when you work on your own wonderment, you
Hmm.
find that you can stick with a certain depth, and when you work with community right now, there you haven't found the opportunity to engage in something that's maybe more intimate, more long term, and more depth. If the should experience was the kind of thing that had the same kind of depth,
Hmm.
would that solve both? Is that a
Um,
little bit of what you're saying?
um, Depth. That's an interesting depth.
Because you
I'm not sure one is more or less deep.
okay.
I'm not
Because you
sure that
said
one is
something
more or
about a
less deep.
community that would stick together, and I
Right.
mean there in terms of action, you can go out and work at a soup kitchen, or I mean, you could do something physical, but maybe perhaps those aren't situations where you could cultivate the level of experience that you cultivate when you do your more or less single person. I mean, I know when you're doing your own
Right.
single person, it's usually you're bouncing off with another one person here, another person there. And
Right.
perhaps there's something about um, that direction, the trajectory of the depth, or the the intimacy of that, if that could translate into um, a structure that's actionable, a group of people that we're doing stuff, maybe that's where it's no longer an either or. Now, that's all I'm thinking, in terms
Hmm.
of um, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. It might not have come up for you like that, but yeah, I think that, in terms of my work, we call that everyday Bardo, right? When you're,
I know. I've
yeah,
been playing with that more.
because it shows up as an either
It's a
or,
good. Right.
and so you have to say to yourself, okay, this is my limit. This is a limitation. I've structurally limited myself to an either or, and
Right.
so you need to suspend that type of inquiry, and you need to trust that you both want to perfect your own way of showing up in the world, and this thing of wanting to attach it, interface it with some altruism or some meaningful action is always
Right.
there. And so I like to imagine what I call a search space. So you just imagine this search space, and those two things are there, and um, it's like hunting for shooting stars in the night sky during one of those times when there's going to be a lot of them. You don't really know where to look, and you don't really know when you're going to see one, but the energy is still looking. Um, and realizing that those two motivations are constantly moving in a search space. And then
Mm-hmm.
the rest is just up to the world. So you have these two motivations, and perhaps that's why you choose this rather than that. Maybe this looks like a single um, or like a selfish thing, but it has to be informed by your need to want to move toward that direction of altruism, because that's also in your energetics of your choosing. It's almost, if those two things are really bothering you, sort of, then they are going to be part of what you choose.
So that's a good statement that I've played with, is like they're implicitly intertwined with each other.
Yeah.
So
And
basically more trust. And I just don't know if that's true.
and the
I actually
thing
just don't know if that's true.
the thing that's compartmentalizing them is when you're looking at something under this aspect versus when you're looking at under that aspect. When you're and that itself, the way you move between looking at them might be because the organism is saying, well, we played a little too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so you let that arise, and 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 just let that all be part of the search space. And there's this term that Ria Beck uses, that you'll get to meet her, and she calls it, all you have to decide is the next elegant step. You don't know why this is right. It feels right. It's not a big step. Check in. It feels right. So then you can relax. Now you're on that. And you just keep looking for these micro steps.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to trust the process. Um, yeah. And it could, I remember one day I wrote a Facebook status because it just occurred to me that my my 1 year projects were going to take 5 years, and my 5 year projects were going to take my whole life. And my horse trainer, she writes back, "Oh, that's so wonderful. Those are the best kinds of projects." So, uh, yeah. I think, we also have a narrative kind of mental structure. So, Steve Jobs warned of this in his Stanford address. He said, you can't connect the dots going up. You can only connect the dots coming down. And I think
Mm-hmm.
this is why we think we're under so much pressure to choose.
Right. Well,
Um,
well, yeah, and this goes back to the other dichotomy I was making between knowing and not knowing, basically. Knowing and not knowing the result, or feeling like I know or don't know the result, the end result of any given action. Sometimes I think I do know the result,
yeah, yeah. And you
and sometimes
can't,
I think I don't.
yeah. That's
And the
like that
ones
old,
when I don't know the result are more fun.
yeah, and it all depends on your time period. Like that old Chinese Taoist story about the farmer and his son. The far
I
and
don't
the
know
son.
that one.
Oh well, the farmer has a son, and the son's helping him with his land, and they've got great crops, and his neighbors come and say, "Oh, you're so lucky. You have that son. He's so wonderful." And the farmer says, "Oh, we'll see." And then the son breaks his leg, falls off of the horse and breaks his leg. And the neighbors come and say, "Oh, that's too bad that your son broke your legs, because now you can't get crops in." And he says, "Oh, well, we'll see." And then the war comes, and because his son has a broken leg, he doesn't have to go to the war. It goes on and on and on. He loses his horse, and he's unlucky, but the horse comes back with a herd of females, and they say he's lucky. And it's just in the Chinese farmer just keeps on saying, "Well, we'll see." And so they asked uh, um, oh, who was it? Ho Chi Minh, I think. They asked him after the Vietnam War, well, what is it, what is something about winning the war? And he just said, oh, well, well, who really won the war? And he'll see, well, he said something like, ask me in 500 years, like you can't really tell what the outcome is. Depends what your long-term perspective is.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh my gosh.
When I was your age, we used to use Ouija boards. It gave us at least the illusion that there was a higher power helping us,
Right,
right?
right, right,
It's
right.
not like that anymore. Sad,
Yeah.
sad to say.
No. No, 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 no. No, there's no high. I don't, but all of the frameworks of guidance and non-guidance live in me. This is sort of like what we were talking about the first time we had a conversation like this. It's like I've had, I believe in and have had experiences of and have, I mean, I can just see determinism and chance are what's happening here.
Hmm.
And I don't care. There's a way in which I want to feel and already do feel that there's choice. So I'm happy to include that in my
Yeah.
experience and act on that basis as well. So there's both, it's both of those simultaneously and dancing through and between each other all the time. And as well as things in between, like higher powers and guidance and synchronicity and
Yeah.
actually trusting basically non-action or the Tao or something like that to lead to the best results. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about it, and I hold them all
Yeah.
at various times, and trying to hold the best one at any given time. And what's deemed to be the best is changing, moment to moment. It's exactly what we talked about before. And at least I can say that it's a very vital way. It requires my full engagement to sort of like stay up to speed and really kind of really struggle with all of this kind of stuff
Yeah.
rather than just ignore it or something. And that's enjoyable.
It brings. I have a couple of things that brings to mind. One is in one of the Magellan courses, we were talking about determinism and chance, and um, this whole play and interweaving of them. And I have this line I like to use. We call it promise and possibility, right? So instead of determinism. So for example, like the stone, right? The stone promises to sit there on the earth. If the stone didn't promise to sit on the earth, I could not have the possibility to pick up and throw it,
Mm.
right? So if you didn't wake up in your same physical body every day, which is somewhat deterministic, meaning it has a lot of promise, right? Then you couldn't get up and walk to the stage, which is your potential or possibility. And so that's a nice way of not seeing them as either or somehow a paradox, right? So part of your life, all is a combination of promise and possibility.
Mm.
And the other thing, I don't know why it reminded me of this, but years and years ago I had a roommate. It's a long time ago. I moved into her house, and her job was the dog warden. And I just couldn't and she loved animals, and I just couldn't understand how she could be optimistic because for every dog she helped, there was, literally hundreds of dogs that were hopeless. And she just said, you just can't look at the you can look at the big picture, but you really, really have to save the ones you can. This is like the next elegant step. You you can't you can't drop the ball because you can't get on top and work from the top down. And so um, I think.
Can I pick at that a little bit?
Hmm. I knew you
Because,
were.
well, I think I a lot of the way that my inquiry works is I hear phrases, kind of cliche phrases or something, common wisdom,
Hmm.
and then I'm like, really? Wait, what does that mean exactly? So you can't dot dot dot. What does that mean?
Okay, yeah, you can then also work from the top down, which she did.
Like you can't you can't look at the big picture so much that you get discouraged, and you have to save the ones that you can. It's
You
like
have to
those, that's
act.
not true.
Well, I think
You can do something else.
no, no. Okay, so when I was saying you can't, she was more talking about you can't let that stop you from doing with what you can. I mean, she also ended up, curiously enough, took the whole system out of the government and the local municipality, and they created a system of animal welfare, and they never euthanized any dogs again. But the point being is that I guess I didn't frame it right because I couldn't understand how she could go and take that job. Like how could she take that job? Well, how could she not be completely overwhelmed with starting? And that's what she was saying. You can't let that stop you, incapacitate you, paralyze you. You have to. It's kind of like you have to do two tracks. You have to. You have to. Well, that was what she said. I mean, in that context, I thought that it was pretty interesting. Um, and so when she started, it was just what she was doing. And in the end, it turned out to be, I mean, she had no idea that they could transform that. What it took was a recession in the 80s, and the governments didn't have the money anymore. And that looked like the worst thing that was going to happen. And they turned it into something that was very beautiful. So um, I think just starting, for me, that moment of just starting was sometimes the hardest.
Hmm. 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 So I pointed to the can't and the have to because I think by questioning those, they open up that search space or the choice field that you're talking about. It's like, what, for me, when I notice that kind of thing in myself and I question it, it immediately becomes like, oh, well, it's basically an inquiry into what's moving, and then I can ask, why is that moving? Why am I going in that direction? And and if I'm looking at what I find, if I find things, if I find movement and I'm looking at them, then I automatically feel like there are multiple ways to go. But when I'm not looking and I'm more, or I'll say more or less, more acting than looking, then I'm not aware of choices that are opposed to each other. Um, that doesn't solve the problem. It's more of a description
Yeah.
than what I find, which I actually, which I do this to myself. I appreciate that kind of honest description, phenomenological description that I do. Um, that kind of what feels to me like elder wisdom, basically, like you can't do this, very simple elder wisdom. And part of me actually thinks that this is sort of like adolescent fighting back. I'm going to figure it out
Yeah.
my own
No.
way, sort of thing. And I think that's true, but it, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else that.
Yeah. Again, the you can't means didn't mean you can't fight City Hall. You can't let the enormity of it paralyze you. That's most what.
But you can.
Well, you should. This is a should word used
Okay, so
as a
good. So
can't. Right. Right.
let's use the
Exactly.
should word. You have to use
Exactly.
language appropriately.
I. So it would be if you really care, then you can't let that paralyze
Mm-hmm.
you. That's what she was looking at. It was like
Great.
it.
See
And the
that
more
feels
you care, the more enormous the obstacle seems. And
yeah,
so instead of having the care feed into the enormity of the task,
right.
this is where the can't means it's not that you can't do it, you're able to do it.
Right.
But this, yeah, the can't is more of a prescriptive term.
Right. That's
Um,
beautiful. That
yeah,
really that bridges the
that,
prescription and description for me. It
yeah,
both feels like wisdom and honest at the same time.
yeah. And that's what she was saying. And I think, yeah, that's neat that we got to that phase, because the problem is that the more the care arises, and maybe this is the trap of working on yourself, right? The more you work on yourself and the more the care arises, the more enormous
Yeah,
the
hugely
problem
enormous. Yeah.
seems. And so this first step, this is the uh, this is maybe how those things are coupled in a way that's not helpful, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Because yeah, right. Because it becomes even more of a burden to take on basically. That's yeah. And that's a kind of middle ground solution that I've that sometimes comes up for me is like, well, just what can you do right now? What can you do right now that you want to do? Or even make it even easier on myself rather than save the world or something like this is what am I already doing? And that
right,
sort of like kind of greases the wheels a little bit
right.
in that direction.
Or what do I like to do that actually can be helpful? And
Mm,
what are the steps that that help that? So we were talking about, if you like to learn, then those people a lot of times like to teach, and
mm-hmm,
you can get to a situation where those things are so intertwined they don't happen, you know they just automatically happen together. So if you're learning in a group situation, then learning is always teaching,
mm-hmm,
and you kind of get both parts of that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question from again, going just back to description and the sense of, and also asking from a younger person to an older person. It seems like as people get older, they tend to recognize how what life comes down to is service, basically, helping others, and that deep kind of happiness comes from something like that. And it it just feels like a natural exhaustion of self-centered activity. And I'm wondering if you agree, and if you do, I'm wondering how you see that exhaustion happens. How does it happen? Why does it happen? Why does self-centered activity become less interesting?
um that's an interesting question. I think it has a lot of different facets. Part of it is you feel that, I mean, this is kind of crazy. I'm not that old, but it happens, you start to count like you shouldn't. I mean, you have to resist it. But what seems to happen naturally is you start to count how many years, this might be the last car I have, or this will be, I happen to have a 6-year-old horse. If it lives as long as my other horse, I'll be, 90 and still be taking care of them. And so you start to be able to think in terms of when you can't do anything anymore.
Hmm.
And so I think that turns the formula around. I think it's really just that. I think it's really how we parse our lives out in terms of open future, and all of a sudden it becomes formulaic in the sense that certain things that you're engaged in you're not going to outlive.
Hmm.
It just becomes a fact,
Hmm.
unless you're Kurtzwell or something, and
Hmm.
So I think that's one aspect of it. I certainly, younger people don't do the math like that. And I also think it's a little bit lack of capacity. I remember years ago learning yet another Adobe program or yet another way to do a web, and I'm like, I just don't want to learn another thing. And it's not that you couldn't. It's just that there's a sense in which these things seem like you're just replacing parts. You're not really moving along anymore. And so the question of moving along then becomes moving into the future when you're not going to be there anymore.
Hmm.
So how can I really move along? Well, changing jobs, I'm not really moving that way. Or reading yet another book, and that's an interesting thing. If you're a good reader, you can read in your field up to the point where, you're waiting for the next thing to be published. You're on the point of reading what's being published at that time, unless you're interested in starting a whole new thing all over. And so then the question is, how do you move beyond that your deadline? Well,
Hmm.
the only way you can do that is adding a structure
That's a
back into the world,
huh.
and
That's
that
a
is
funny
a way
phrase
of,
you use, deadline.
yeah, hold on. I mean, I have ideas now where I think that, so I was just saying this to someone the other day. I was saying that I didn't think that um, anything that I'm doing, I'm going to actually finish, really to come to fruition in my lifetime, especially because some of the stuff I've started is so kind of like radical. But I really have this very strong feeling that this is what's going to be happening after I'm dead, and I kind of like that. I don't know. It didn't sound like a bad thing. So the only way to do that is to work with other people and work with systems or institutions or structures that will serve that interest, has a greater longevity than your physical self does. And that looks like service. But
Right.
it
Yeah,
can
right.
can feel like an ego campaign too, I
Huh.
mean, just whatever way you look at it.
Huh.
Um, yeah, to me the more unusual form of altruism are these stories of young people staying with their parents, and like a sick parent, and really dedicating their whole lives to um, their parent. That to me is a more unusual case of altruism, because the past and future is kind of reversed there. Yeah, so it's something like that. I'm
Yeah.
sure other people answer it in a different way.
I thought that was beautiful. And that felt very true to me also. Felt very true. Hmm. Hmm.
That it's actually some something that can serve as the new economy. I mean, that's how money should work. Money should work so it carries forward, right, into the investment period, or the way that money uh, accumulates is way too fast.
Hmm.
It doesn't follow those waves, those generational waves into the future.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Huh. That's interesting. That's really interesting. So, because as you were just talking, that there's a deep parallel to something else I was thinking just as you were saying that before, is like, um, I've noticed that there's a change, starting to be a little bit of a change in how I think, whereas I tend to think often in terms of getting something, or or endpoints, completing projects, or establishing new relationships or new skill sets or something like that. But recently I've been thinking more in terms of, and also like achieving goals or sustainability or something like this. But recently I started thinking a tiny bit in terms of never finishing anything. Never getting anywhere or finishing anything, basically, which is what your horse trainer friend
Yeah.
said. Because it was like, what would it be like if me and if organizations in general didn't have like 20-year plans? Like, what is a 20-year plan? What's an infinite plan? What does it mean to act in terms of contributing to something that's going on forever?
You know, I have to laugh because you were saying that, and I envisioned you as one of my employees in a business meeting and waving their hand and says, why are we doing a 20-year plan? Why don't we do an infinite plan? I mean, like, get this guy out of the room. Anyways, no, exactly.
Well, actually, before we go there, tell me what is this reaction of get this guy out of the room?
Because in a business situation, it's just a business situation. Traditional business is so limiting, like can't even get on a 3-year plan, and I don't know. I just thought it would make a cute cartoon kind of
Uh-huh.
thing.
Yeah, I
The
know. I
average
just want to sort of.
business person having this bright, young, new kind of mentality come
Right.
in, and they'd be like, it just wouldn't fit in their reality,
What would be the emotional reaction of that person? I'm trying to get
Uh,
underneath the joke because I don't want to. I understand it in the sense of I assume it to be true of certain types of people, but why? What is
well,
the
yeah. Well, the reaction would be they would think you were fucking with them,
uh,
right? They would never think you were serious. And this is, of course, the problem people have with young people all the time. They think that it's an attitude problem. And when in reality, you're envisioning something that is possible, you know? And and I can imagine that happening in school all the time. Well, why are we doing this? Why don't we do that? And it turns um, the relationship the elder is having with the child is that there's an attitude problem. Because at first it can come out as innocent like that, and then there's pushback, and then the child is like, no, 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 and then they're like, just be quiet. And so I would suspect that that would be the situation in a conventional organization.
That's great. Thanks.
But Kierkegaard said, very very famous quote. He said, "It's much better to it's much better that life is finished with you before you're finished with life." Can you imagine being like 60 and having nothing else to do? That'd be awful.
It would be awful. I'm lucky in the sense that I've grown up not expecting to be able or want to retire.
Yeah.
So I've been planning for constant and planning for continual
Yeah.
growth.
And that was a trap. People had this impression that they went to school, that was fun, then they had their career, and then when they were 65 they'd finally lived the life they wanted, and there was no life left.
Mm,
So now we can start actually living our life.
mm,
That was kind of a narrative that was going around then.
mm.
You see, the captains of industry are doing you a favor.
Mm-hmm. 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 I know, and it kind of forces the question back, which comes back to the question of infinite action. Is like, um, well, it's basically a question of why or what's the point, which I've been asking for a long time. Like, not if the point of going to school and getting a job, and I also think that this is a very generalized narrative. I know that there's lots of people who, did the retirement thing and don't feel this way, but um, um, I'll wait till I retire and then start living my life then. But I don't have that option. So
Right.
I've always tracked back and been like, okay, well, if I'm going to start living my life now, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And what does that even mean? And what would I why would what would I want to do and why? Which comes back to these questions. And
Yeah.
since there is no sense of established end except for my death, but even that's in question in multiple ways. So yeah, I want to explore this topic of acting for infinity more.
Yeah. So it's kind of more of an American problem than there's a lot of other cultures where people they just farm until they're 90 and then they're dead. They are not in conflict with their work. Their work is their life. And I mean, I'm not talking about modernization where people are in these huge sweatshops and stuff like that. I'm talking about just in other countries there are situations where that myth isn't there. Um, Certainly, um, that's changing. Like in the industrialization of these um, third world countries or developing countries, people are starting to make those means ends decisions. I'm going to work in this factory right now so I can save
Mm,
enough money, but then the whole economy moves at a faster pace and you can't ever get beyond those means ends problem.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And so if we look at the Quakers, it's one of the few societies in this country who look at that means ends problem straight on. They think about, well, we could develop this industry. If they can't see it 360 degrees around, so it improves their lives, then they don't do it. And until they can see a system that will improve their lives and not get them on chasing fewer hours and more work, then they don't adopt it. It's not that they're just ideologically against it. So um, we all have to start thinking as Quakers now or something.
mm,
Um, yeah, and just realizing that um, it's kind of it's a kind of a it's less of a punctuated thing. You go to school, you go to work, you go to this, and then you retire. It's more like you live your life.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It's the whole current.
mm-hmm,
Um, yeah, and so people it gives people permission, like who are in school, to take a couple of years off because there's not this kind of structure so much. Um, yeah, which is could be good. Um, so I thought of something about your original question. I think just you can turn your original question about this conflict between individual fulfillment and altruism
mm-hmm,
into um, an inquiry, a living inquiry, like how could you be involved in creating some structure or some process or some movement where that solves those kinds of problems for many people like you. You know what I'm saying? So
mm-hmm,
in the process of solving your problem, you make it something that has
mm-hmm,
the energy to draw in
mm-hmm,
others like you that are probably coming down the pipe with the same difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that sounds interesting. Huh. I don't know how the problem is going to get solved. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to get solved. You know what I've done in the past is I've been like, I'm not going to feel good about myself unless I'm doing some kind of a lot of, you know, service work, either explicit and or implicit. And so I've just done it, but just doing it is sort of rotting away as an option. And so now there's more fluidity,
Yeah.
and it's become a question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I had the same kind of problem before where I had my job and I used the proceeds of my job to do my
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly.
work and it was chopped up. And now it's all one thing.
Right,
And it's uncomfortable for me because I don't know what that model is like. I don't know how it works. I haven't
right.
seen anything work like that. So it's they're kind of living questions.
Well, let's question this service thing. So I still feel confused about what obligation is and what service is. And I'm thinking unconscious there's a pre-conscious and a conscious version of this, or maybe a pre-trans thing or something like that. So first I'm thinking about bumblebees. And bumblebees do what they want to do, or what they need to do, however you want to say that, to survive. And they
Right.
also help flowers a lot. And they make beautiful flowers. And everybody gets to enjoy the flowers. And, and the flowers get to survive, get to live too. So it was never split. They were part of an ecosystem.
Hmm.
And so then what happened to that? Because now I don't think, then we get to some situation where people are making decisions between what their work is and then giving back. Somehow there seems to be a difference between those two things. They don't feel like part of an ecosystem. And now you're talking about the reintegration where your work is service, but it still feels like the categories are somewhat separate. So there's this weird tension between not knowing exactly how to do that. And also we're talking about a new way of just living your life because you're not under the impression that that um that there's no end to get to. But I still have the question, does that lead to good things for other people? It certainly works for the bumblebees, but I don't actually know if I'm part of a healthy ecosystem where my actions that I want to do will lead to benefits for other creatures.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions in that, right?
Yeah, a lot of
I'm
questions.
I'm going to agree with you. I mean, the problem is the categories don't work for us.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I would admit that when I say, because I can make distinctions and I say I don't have a model, I don't know what that looks like, it means even my language is not working for me.
Right.
So that's one aspect of working on just the way you label things. But, I have this koan and it's an unsolvable thing and you're touching on it. It's really here's mine, right?
Yeah.
So when you start taking the ecology narrative, we have gotten very good at looking at all animals and seeing that that they fit into a natural ecology. So I can look at the beaver and he's cutting down all the trees and that looks like damage, but then I know that he makes a dam and then the fish can come and then it's a different type of ecosystem. So then it looks like construction and really nice. But then, the beavers may move on and then I want to save my pond, but the forest is slowly silting it up, which is happening, and the forest is going to take it back. So now I look at that as destruction. But then, so we've gotten very good at understanding that, or at least telling the story of for everything we think is a parasite, it has a benefit. The
Mm-hmm.
wolf actually benefits the elk.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I say, okay, so what's the same story with people? What are people for? That's my koan. What are people for? I mean, we come along and we just
Yeah,
destroy
right. Exactly.
everything.
This
And
is exactly right. This is
so
exactly right.
there should be a mind that says, but the destruction is like us seeing the beaver destroying the forest. Like there's this other side. Like, is there another side? Like, what are people for? What's the same? What are people for?
Yeah, right. Because I know people who think of humans as a cancer.
Yeah, and
They
then
don't
some
think they're
people
for
say,
anything except destruction.
that cancer is, biology's way of accelerating the evolution of the human. I mean, it, I don't know. It's an interesting question. You know,
And the climate crisis is like right at the heart of this question for us too, in terms of our own self-understanding. There's kind of
yeah.
like a feeling of, well, I don't know, let's see what happens in the next couple hundred years, and then we'll know what humans are for.
What are people for? What were the dinosaurs for? Oh, we got a good story at that. Everything that's come before was to make people. That's like our
What are
story.
people for?
But what are people for? Well, this is the question.
Well,
Um,
it is the question, but I mean, comparing ourselves to an ecosystem is, well, I guess I don't really know what a sustainable ecosystem is in the sense that ecosystems change. So no ecosystem is permanent, but all ecosystems on Earth that we know of have led to future ecosystems, to more ecosystems until now, and we're sort of. But see, even if we all die out, there's going to be more ecosystems. So it's not like it's just a little confusing.
well, it's a koan. And so one of the moves you can make is think of that nothing on the earth is evolving, but the earth itself is evolving, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what are so we're just part of the evolving story of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's this is a great philosophical move because it answers the question, but it begs the question because it switches the
Right.
question to, well,
Just
what is the earth
yeah, right.
for?
Just
Right? But I really like it because it solves my immediate problem.
that's well. Okay, this is great. This is great. It's good. This is wonderful. Purpose. Oh man, this gets so deep. Purpose and telos and the omega point and all this stuff are wrapped up in this question. Let's go back to the bumblebee.
Okay.
Okay. Without a mind to make the connections between the bumblebee and the flower, what's the bee's purpose?
Well, if you didn't have a mind that couldn't make the connection, you couldn't answer that question. That's not really a good question.
Really? I think it's a great question.
You think so?
Yeah.
I don't understand it then. You mean for the bee itself?
Yeah, for the bee itself. Because if that's what we are, the question is either it feels like the the question isn't really answerable. There's either no purpose in the sense of like kind of implicit. There's no purpose. Like the bee doesn't know what purpose it is. It's just acting, which we find
Yeah.
ourselves in that situation anyway. Or there's no purpose on a grand scale in the sense that anything that leads to something just leads to something else, and there's no, even if there was some kind of like massive wonderful bliss out of the entire universe that everything was leading to, who cares? Maybe that'll lead to something else and it'll do it again, so it keeps going on and on and on. Like, that doesn't seem like any kind of, just because something's wonderful doesn't mean it's the basis for an end point or a purpose.
Right.
So Then on some middle scale, all we have are purposes in the sense of instrumental action and consequence. All of those seem to be true. The question seems unfounded. The problem seems to be with the question, not with the answer.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. The question, but there are some things that we can say, I think, like I believe there's no ultimate purpose, no big totalizing purpose, but I think there's deep purposefulness in the world. Like I think the
Oh.
bee, the energy comes up in the bee and it moves. It has to move and it moves as the bee in the way the bee moves. That's purposiveness. It feels when you've seen those bees when it's get cold and you can actually pet them because they're
Oh.
cold, and then the sun hits them and they start to wake up. It feels the warmth, and then the warmth is the purposiveness comes up and they have to fly. This is deep purposiveness. The bacteria swims uphill against a nutrient gradient, so that's so interwoven everywhere at all these scales that there's this deep purposiveness in the world. And then we tend to be a part of that and then try to answer the big question,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which curiously, because now I'm thinking of your question, because if we're the kinds of minds that can look at these other levels of being and make up these purpose stories, perhaps the only person who can answer, the only being that can answer the question, what are people for, have to be
Higher minds.
higher minds at really a different um, level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sometimes I think the purpose of people is ex- well, one of the ways in which I at least enact this is if you know that the bees have this important role on the planet, then the purpose of people is to promote the conditions for that purpose to happen. That's like,
Mm.
to me, the
That's an
knowing the
interesting. That's
knowing
interesting.
that
Oh, I don't. I don't.
is
I don't agree though. That was rude. Um, um, but let me explain because I think that sounds to me like rationalization, and what
yeah, the
and
person
I
being
don't believe in I don't buy it.
yeah, I definitely think it's a story, but I like the story. So,
Oh, yeah, right. So then it goes back to that. And then I can question myself too, like rationalization. Just dismissing rationalization out of hand as if it doesn't lead to something is really terrible. It's really sort of squashes me. That's like started practicing Zen and I became all anti-intellectual, anti-mind. And then I was like, what the fuck? That's ridiculous. What's wrong with mind? Mind can be beautiful. Why can't you trust mind? Let's
yeah,
actually find out where mind goes. Why don't we give mind a chance rather than negate it out of hand?
give mind a chance. You're the new Lenin.
So I apologize
No, no, I
for
like that.
squashing the
No, I don't think it's.
rationalization.
I don't think my story is rational. I think it's a myth.
Mm,
Yeah, and that's. I like it.
mm, mm, mm-hmm. Yeah, right, exactly. Because I think there's yeah, and you know what I just to clarify, I think the difference is rationalization. What does that mean? That means not being clear about your emotional response to something. That means feeling fear and saying that you have something right instead of saying, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's not what you meant.
That's not what I meant.
Right.
That's not what I meant. And when you say I like it and it's a myth, you're not doing that. That's not a
Right, right. Everything's transparent. But I also know that all these flowers that I've planted that bloom late in the fall when the bees don't have a lot of food, and
mm-hmm.
they're just like hundreds of these fuzzy little bumblebees there. I also know, without rationalizing or mythologizing, that it feels really good.
Huh. Huh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like this. Okay. So because I've been feeling since we for about 10 minutes now, I've been feeling an implicit solution to this problem, which is that the problem is with the question, and although it seems to me as if I have conflicting purposiveness, whatever you said, that's fine. And I might not be able to see the purposiveness. It's a simplistic metaphor to say that the purposiveness of the bacteria is to swim up the gradient stream, and then to apply it to me
Hmm.
as if I could that could hold. And maybe it does hold for some people. They just know what they want to do, but that's not clear for me. And so to
Right.
try to apply that to myself is difficult, and I don't think true. So on the basis of that freedom to have multiple purposivenesses and to follow them without a sense of there needing to be an ultimate purpose, I would like to continue following with your story.
Well,
And what
the bees can answer it for you. If you stood out here in the sun late in the fall and you watched them and their little dance, and maybe they could answer that for you.
and you would say that your purpose is because you recognize their importance is to support their existence and continued purposiveness.
Right. So, for example, let's instead of trying to imagine the higher mind answering,
Yeah.
let's look at the level between the human and the animal. And this is something I teach in my dancing shadow course, which heavily relies on myth, because shadow archetypes, myth.
Yeah.
Um, so Hartshorne had this concept of incompatible goods in
Hmm.
the animal realm. And that just means, it's good for the fox to catch the rabbit to feed her babies, but it's good for the rabbit to escape to go home and feed her babies. So they're both goods. There's not good and evil in the animal realm. They're just incompatible goods. And so the fox, he can't answer like what are rabbits for or what are foxes for, but we can see from a higher perspective that we can understand that from the fox's perspective, that's a hard thing to see. The rabbit is a good and not an evil, but from a higher perspective, we can see they're incompatible goods. And I believe that a higher perspective, if you could get one, if you weren't a person, you could see that the kinds of incommensurabilities we have are the same, function the same way that incompatible goods function at the animal realm. And it turns out in all the realms beneath the animal you have different types of exclusionary principles, and it happens at all the different realms. And where shadow comes in is that each one of these exclusionary branches, and the exclusion being an illusion, we choose one over the other, right?
Hmm.
So that's how shadow gets involuted over time. But um, so these conflicts of purposes in the human realm are, maybe we can't solve them rationally, but from a different unattainable perspective, maybe it works the same. I don't know.
Hmm. And it keeps coming to me that it works the same. If it works the same, it works the same in relationship. It doesn't work the same ultimately. Telling the story about the fox and the rabbits or the bees and the flowers doesn't answer the story about the Earth and the solar system or the universe as a whole. It's
No,
that, again, that question just never gets asked.
not at this
So,
scale.
right, not at
This is
that
all
scale.
within that story of the earth, because we exported the
Right,
question of the earth.
right, right. So if it works on from a higher mind about us, it just, again, relate. I think I think the concept of relationship is, for me, it's gone really, really, really deep as a very good explanation of um, interdependence, for example, or emptiness, rather than being nothing or something, but or even neither of those, but just relationship. And you know, I think this is the right context to bring this in, but Adida had a big koan for himself about am I avoiding relationship? And just in terms of the relative world, it seems like this is going back to what I was talking about around altruism. It seems so crystallized around committed relationship and seeing people in their fullness and meeting them there, including in their in the sense egoity, personalness, sense of limited self. It just seems like, in the sense that purposefulness lies in relationship with other things. Not, and it doesn't answer the question of a higher purpose of all of us together, but it does answer the question of the purposeness of each of us in relationship to each other, being together, basically, serving roles for each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's very deep and very multi-leveled and multi-layered. One of the problems in Buddhist scholastics is we tend to, the notion of, there are several ultimate concepts in Buddhist scholastics. There's emptiness and form, and then there's codependent arising and spontaneous arising. And we in the West don't pay much attention to codependent arising and spontaneous arising. We're all hung up on emptiness and form.
Mm.
But those, as far as my understanding is, those four are the ultimate conceptual ultimates. It's not like emptiness is the conceptual ultimate. They all are, it's almost like Wilber's. They arise together, and so a lot of different traditions want to take the fullness or the interrelationship, the codependent arising, and say that that ultimately rests in emptiness. But there's an equal argument to show that emptiness ultimately rests in codependent arising. They all can be seen from and anchor each other, and that's why they're the four ultimate conceptual ultimates. So yeah, I'm just agreeing with you that you can certainly specialize, I guess, in one or the other, but yeah, that's a good question for people in terms of emptiness and codependent arising. If
What's the question?
When people anchor their spiritual practice in emptiness as the absolute, then how does that relate with the principle of codependent arising in Buddhism? How are those two ultimate concepts reconcile with each other? I mean,
I just,
there is a scholastic argument, but that takes too long to go through.
Loops. There's just loops and loops and loops in being and in relationships between conception and emotional, looking for a conceptual solution to something, then looking for an emotional solution to something, and conceptual solution to something, bringing up an emotional problem, and such and such and such. And it's nice to play in that space with you. It's nice to play in that space with you in the sense of that you understand what the hell is happening over here. And in a sense that, like, we're really taking the whole shitstorm seriously, which it feels like is necessary to do if we're going to find something new that isn't so convoluted.
Yeah, I think the goal, I would say the goal is, if you want to play, I have my own mythology, my own little ways of, I'm not saying I'm solved my problem, what are people for? I just play with a mythology and I'm open to that question that's always going. But, I think the difference is that works for me. That's what has been constellated in my life. But I think for someone like you, there's a surprise waiting. You might constellate that understanding in a whole different way. And
Right,
that's really cool.
right.
Um,
That's why I'm really curious. I don't exactly know what you mean by post-dialectics, but every time I read about post-dialectics or think about post-dialectics, I always feel like this is like, is this it or something? I don't know. There's just some draw. There's just some excitement. There's like a simplicity
yeah,
post-complexity where I'm like, oh, it doesn't undo the motion. It just makes it so that like motion isn't as totally disturbing and disruptive and full of loops and something like
hmm
that. So it's just like it's simpler.
yeah. Now that's a good insight because the branching from myth to mental required the ability for the mind to stop something, to slice it a certain way and stop it. And in the cultures where their language was more verbal and movement oriented, they didn't get into dialectical thinking. And to move beyond dialectical thinking, you move toward either Western process philosophy or Eastern process Buddhism. And again, it's right. So you move out of dialectic by being comfortable with not stop with your mind not stopping, looking around, separating something as if there are structures there, but being comfortable with constant movement, and that is consistent with that.
Yeah, and it seems like there's just multiple. This is where it gets weird because there's multiple themes, at least in, I don't, I don't presume to know about movements in other cultures or global future or anything like that. I know a very limited dialogue about a very limited culture, but postmodern American culture, again, and just going back to technology too, everything's changing so fucking fast. Values are all up in the air. There's movement everywhere. There's relative movement everywhere where there was less relative movement before. So it just makes it both necessary and ripe ground
Yeah,
for post-dialectics to emerge. It's like it has to, otherwise people are going to freak out. Like I think nervous systems require
yeah,
post-dialectics now. Otherwise, we're going to freak out and go insane.
yeah. It's a both and. It's a product and a victim. In other words, Einstein could not have relativized everything if he
Interesting.
had a stuck dialectical mind. I mean, it wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, when Plato was coming out of the mythic period, his mind was different. He couldn't think of ideals and contraries. And in fact, he called the ability to do that diaresis. You had to separate into these abstract ideals and then work with them by keeping them separated. So it's easy to report or to predict post-dialectical mind because it's just
Mm-hmm.
happening. It's
Mm-hmm.
You're right. Our technology, you could not invent, well, the internet is interesting, but the way we think of distributed networks and all this stuff, it couldn't be imagined with an old mindset. So it's both and. The mindset starts to change the technology
Mm-hmm.
reinforces the mindset. People are born
Mm-hmm.
into the technology, which completely fits them into the new mindset. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and the pace of it increases. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm really only trying to observe what is and pretend I'm responsible. Take all the credit.
Oh man, it's exciting, man. It's exciting. Transparency, you know what? Yeah, we gotta stop. We've gone too far
All
with this
right,
conversation.
this is a good
But
one so
yeah, this
far.
is just more and more and more. Thanks, Bonita.